Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on implementing our new title scene into our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so previously we worked on adding in most of the core logic that we're going to need for our title scene, and we start connecting this scene to some of our other scenes in our game. However, one of our outstanding items is tied to our UI component for where we're running out our menu options to our player. So currently we're using a phaser image game object, and we are using the built-in scaling methods to scale out this image. However, because we're stretching it, it's distorting some of our borders. And so as an example, our default image here from our glass panel has these really nice, clear, crisp corners. But once we go ahead and stretch that, it's distorting our whole image. And so to resolve that issue, there's a few ways we could do this. We could create new images outside of Phaser and then just import them in and use those. Or another option is we could use the 9-slice scaling technique to go ahead and stretch our image horizontally and vertically while maintaining our corners of our image, so then that way it doesn't appear to be distorted. And so if you're not familiar with the 9-slice scaling technique, basically what this is we take our image and we cut it into 9 parts, and basically we define our corner cuts for our corners that we want to remain the same. And then so what we'll do is for the rest of our pieces, we'll dynamically calculate their width and height based on our original image and what we want to stretch it to. So in the example here, we have our corners, so 1 through 7 and 9, and they're staying the same size. But then we're stretching our overall image by stretching 2, 4, 5, 6, and 8. And this results in a nice looking rounded corner still, instead of just stretching it manually where the corners are no longer rounded properly. Alright, for us to go ahead and implement the 9-slice scaling technique in Phaser 3, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to reuse some code that I previously written for applying this technique. And so there's going to be a link in the description of this video to the source code, and we're going to go ahead and use this as our starting point to build our own custom class for creating our 9-slice instance. And so this code comes from another video where I walk through how we can use Phaser's built-in game objects, as well as the texture manager to go ahead and create our own 9-slice instance by taking a simple image and then breaking it up into 9 separate textures. And then once we have that, we create our game objects and then we draw them out to our scene. And so if you're interested in learning more about this, there's going to be a link in the description of this video, and as well as a link on the screen now if you want to go ahead and check out that video. So we won't be going through the code completely in depth and over the whole technique. I do recommend checking out that video if you'd like more details. Alright, so what you'll want to do is you want to go ahead and open that link, and what we're going to do is we're going to grab that code, and let's come back to our IDE. And we're just going to put that in a brand new file, and let's go ahead and paste it over there. So the first thing we'll do is let's come into our source folder, let's go into our utils subfolder, and we're going to make a new file called 9-slice. And in this file, let's go ahead and export out a new class, and we're just going to call this 9-slice. And in this class, we'll just go ahead and add our constructor, and we're going to go ahead and add in config for what we expect, and then we'll go ahead and leave it blank for the time being. So what we're going to work on doing is we're going to work on moving our code out of what we copied here into our new class. And so at a high level, what the code has currently is this just creates a basic Phaser 3 game instance. And so you see where we have a game configuration, and then a reference is a single scene called game. And so inside this scene, basically all we're doing is we're loading in a new asset, so we're loading a new image into our game, and then what we're doing is there's just really 2 main parts of the code. The first thing we do is we grab our texture of that image from our texture manager, and by doing that, that allows us to access the frames on our texture. So typically when you load an asset that is an image, there's only going to be a single frame called base, and basically this is all the whole image data. And so that's why when you create your image game objects and you render out to the default frame, it renders out the whole image onto your game object. Versus if you want to go ahead and load in a sprite sheet, typically you define your frame widths and heights, and then you have to specify which frame you want to render out. Otherwise, phaser will default to the first frame. And so our first part of our code is we're taking that initial texture that has that single frame, and we're going to go ahead and create our 9 frames that represent the pieces we need to render out for our image. And so what the code's doing is it's dynamically calculating our width and height of how to cut this image into various pieces, and then it adds those as frames to our texture. And so by doing that, our texture now has the data we need to go ahead and pick a single frame and apply it to a game object. So once we do that, the other part of our code starts here on line 83. And basically all we do is now we create 9 game objects. So 9 image game objects, and we position them in our scene kind of like this, and we apply our various frames that we created. And what this will result in is we're going to have a nice overall image that is now stretched horizontally and vertically based on the dimensions we provide. And it's all using that original image and just using custom frames we've defined. The last part of the code is we just take all those image game objects and we put them in a container. So then that way we can just position the container and everything will be positioned relatively inside that container. All right, so now that we reviewed the code at a high level, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to break up our code into 2 parts. Our first part is going to be creating our textures like we talked about, and then the second part will be where we create our game objects and we go ahead and create our container. So what we're going to go ahead and do is in our 9slice class, let's go ahead and add in 2 new methods. Our first method will be a private method, and we're just going to call this create 9slice textures. And this method will be responsible for grabbing our texture manager and grabbing our asset and adding in those frames. So what we'll want to go ahead and do is we're going to copy all of our code starting here on line 37, and we're going to copy all the way down to right before we start creating our image game objects. And so we're going to go ahead and place that in that method. And then what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add our public method for creating our 9slice container. And so we're just going to call this create 9slice container. And inside this method, we'll want to grab our remaining code where we create our container and our game object. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and paste it over here. And so one last thing we want to go ahead and do is let's copy this object here for our asset cut frames. And so what this object is used for is when you add your frames to your texture manager, you have to give them a unique key, and then that way Phaser knows how to reference and associate them. So similar like when we load in our assets, we need a unique value for those as well. And so basically for our frames, we're just referencing like our top left, top middle, top right, and then same thing for our middle and our bottom rows. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our constructor. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define what config actually is. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add some code here for our jsdoc type for our 9slice config. And so our config is going to be an object that's going to have 3 properties on it. The first one's going to be a corner cut size. And so our corner cut size is going to be our width and our height of when we cut out our frame for each of our corners. So in our existing code, we currently have a corner cut here that's hard-coded, and we're going to go ahead and remove that. And basically that's going to be replaced by our value we provide to our 9slice instance. Next, we're going to go ahead and pass in our Phaser 3 texture manager. So in order to go ahead and get your texture that's tied to an asset, you need to use the Phaser 3 texture manager and provide the name of the asset that you want to get, and this will go ahead and return a texture game object. And then from there, that's how we go ahead and grab our frames and add new frames to it. So previously, we were accessing our texture manager by using our Phaser scene, grabbing our systems manager, and then going ahead and grabbing the texture manager from that. Instead of having to pass in our scene, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll pass in our texture manager, and then that way we'll just have a direct reference to it. Finally, the last thing we'll need is we'll need that asset key. So the asset key is what we'll pass to the texture manager. All right, so what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to add 2 new private properties to our class, and this is going to be for our corner cut size and our asset key, because we're going to reference those in multiple locations. So what we'll go ahead and do is we'll do corner cut size, and we will do our asset key, And we'll go ahead and add in our types real quick for these. And so for our corner cut size, this is going to be a number, and our asset key will be a string. And then what we'll do in our constructor is we'll just go ahead and assign those values based on what's passed to our config. So we'll have our config, and then we'll have our corner cut size. And just so we have our IntelliSense, let's go ahead and add in our jsdoc for our constructor. And so now we'll have our 9-slice config. And now we can go ahead and do this. We'll do our asset key. And we're going to assign that equal to our config and our asset key. And then what we'll want to do is when we create an instance of our 9-slice class, we'll want to go ahead and grab and create our textures right away. So we're going to go ahead and call our create 9-slice textures internal method. And then that way we'll have our textures ready to go for when we want to go ahead and create our container. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we'll go ahead and update our create 9-slice textures method. And so the first thing we'll want to do is we're going to want to update our reference to our texture manager. And so to do that, we're going to go ahead and add a new parameter for our texture manager. And then what we'll do is we're going to replace this sys.textures with our texture manager, and we'll call get. And then what we need to do is we need to update our assets keys here to go ahead and reference our asset key that was provided. So we'll go ahead and add a new parameter, and we'll call this asset key. And then what we need to do is we just need to update our reference here with that string. And then so next, what we're going to want to do is we need to update all of our references of corner cut to reference our private property on our class. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it into our find and replace. I'm just going to go ahead and replace this with this and our corner cut size. Then what I'm going to go ahead and do is we'll paste that in, and we'll want to turn on to make sure we're matching only the whole word so we don't do any subsections of our other words. And I'm going to go ahead and do replace. And so basically what that's going to do, it's going to replace all of our references inside our method here with our new private property. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and save, and let's come down to our create 9-slice container method. So for our create 9-slice container method, the first thing we want to go ahead and do is we're going to need our phaser 3 scene. So currently before it was in our create method, and we were referencing the phaser scene using this keyword. And so we'll need to go ahead and pass in the scene that we want to add our game objects to. Then we're going to want to abstract our target width and our target height, so then that way these are not hard-coded. And so this is going to be our target width and height that we'll want of our new image that's going to be stretched. So let's go ahead and get rid of these two variables, and then we're going to go ahead and replace this.add.image with our scene.add.image. All right, then next we'll want to go ahead and replace our asset key panel with the reference to our asset key. So if we can go ahead and copy that, let's go ahead and go into our find and replace, and we'll go ahead and replace it with this in our asset key. And we'll go ahead and save. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and return the container that we create. And we need to do scene.add container. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and change this to 0, 0. So then that way we're not going to position it anywhere special inside our method. We'll do it outside in our scene when we get our instance back. So one last thing we're going to do is we're going to change our asset cut frames variable name to align with our pattern we've been using so far in our game. And so we're going to do asset cut frames, and we'll go ahead and do a find and replace on all of those, and we'll go ahead and save. All right, so with the logic we have in our class so far, we should be able to go ahead and test our changes and see if it's working properly. So to go ahead and do this, let's jump over to our title scene. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a new private property to keep track of our 9-slice instance. And so what we'll do is we'll add our private property. We're going to call this 9-slice menu. And for our type, this is just going to be our 9-slice class. Then what we'll do is we're going to add the init method for our scene. And inside our init method, this is where we'll create our instance of our 9-slice instance. So we'll do this. We'll have our 9-slice menu is going to be equal to new 9-slice. And we'll need to go ahead and provide our configuration. So for our corner cut size, we'll go ahead and do 32 pixels. Then for our texture manager, we'll reference our scene. We'll go ahead and grab our systems manager, and we'll go ahead and grab our texture manager. Then finally, we need to provide our asset key, and so we're going to use our UI asset keys, and we'll do our menu background. And real quick, we'll go ahead and update our log message to point to our init method. All right, if we go ahead and save, we should be able to test our changes. Oh, so it looks like we have an issue. Let's jump back over to our class. Yes, so when we crawl our private method, we didn't actually pass in our arguments. So we'll go ahead and pass in our config, our texture manager, and we'll go ahead and do our config, and we're going to do our asset key. So now if we go ahead and save, we will see an immediate change right away. And so what's happening is when Phaser renders out an image game object, what it will typically do is it's going to grab the texture for that image. And typically on your images, there's only going to be one frame. And that one frame is going to be your base frame that has the whole image data. And then when Phaser renders out that image game object, it uses all of that image data to draw the whole image. Since we took that texture and we added new frames to it, our new default frame is no longer the base frame, it's now our top left frame. And so what happens is in our top left frame, we've only defined part of our image that we want to go ahead and cut out. And so now on our original image game object, it's using that frame by default. Versus if we passed in our base, we should be able to go ahead and render that out. So as an example, if we come back to our code and let's come down to our create method where we create our menu. So when we add in our menu background, if we go ahead and add in a frame and we reference that base frame, what's going to happen is that base frame still exists and we have our whole image data. And now we can go ahead and render that out. All right, so now we validated our frames are actually being added to our texture. What we want to do is we want to replace our menu background and our menu background container with our new 9-slice container. And so what we'll go ahead and do is let's go ahead and get rid of our menu background. And then for our menu background container, we want to go ahead and reference our 9-slice menu instance. And we're going to call our create 9-slice container method. And now we need to pass in this phaser scene. And now we need to provide our width and our height. And so for our width, we'll do our menu background width. And our height, we'll go ahead and do 200 pixels. So now when we save our game, we're going to see right away we have a completely different image or rectangle being rendered to our screen. And so now we can see that our 9-slice game object is working properly. So we have our original image with our 9 pieces, and we're rendering them all out to our game here. And this just results in a much better looking UI component since it's no longer distorted. All right, so now that we validate our logic for our 9-slice class is working properly, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to jump back to our class, and we're just going to add some safety guards for when we go ahead and create our textures. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll come to our create 9-slice textures method. And inside this method, the first thing we want to do is after we get our asset key, we're going to want to make sure that it exists. And if it doesn't exist, we'll want to go ahead and return early. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to add an if statement. And we're going to say if our texture.key is equal to __ missing, then what we're going to do is we're going to console and we'll do a warning message that we're missing something. And so what we'll do is I'm just going to jump back to our title scene and I'm going to copy our format for our log line from our create method. So we'll just copy this line here. We're going to go ahead and paste that in our warning message and we'll change this to 9-slice. And then we need our method name. So I'm just going to make a new variable and store that because we're going to have a few log lines. What we'll do is we'll just grab that and let's go ahead and add that here. And what we'll say for our message, we're just going to say the provided texture asset key was not found. So what happens is if you provide an asset key that doesn't have a texture, it cannot be found, Phaser is going to return a texture game object, but the key will say missing. So as an example, if we come back to where we create our instance of our 9-slice game object here, if we go to where we create an instance of our 9-slice class here, if we go ahead and pass in some type of asset key that we don't have, like foo, what's going to happen is by default, Phaser is going to try to use that asset and it's going to render out a broken image. But if we jump over to our console log, we'll see right away we have our warning message where our provided texture was actually not found. And so what we actually want to do is when we have that happen, we're just going to return and not actually run any more of our code. And what we could do is we could throw an error and we could handle the error differently. But for the time being, we're just going to go ahead and return early. So then what we'll do is we're going to revert our change back so we have our asset, and then that way we proceed past that if check. And then next what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our frames has our base key here. Because this is vital for us to go ahead and get the width and the height from our original image from the asset that we provide. And so if this frame doesn't actually exist, we won't be able to run the rest of our code. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to copy this block of code and we are going to just paste this right here. We'll do not texture and we're going to reference frames and we'll say base. So we'll copy this here, our underscore base. If that doesn't exist, then we're going to go ahead and just log a message. We'll say provided texture asset key does not have a base texture. And we'll also go ahead and return early in that instance. So this shouldn't happen, but this is just a safeguard in case it doesn't, because we do need that frame. And then finally, we're just going to add one more safety check tied to if we've already added our frames to our texture. So if you can imagine, if we create multiple instances of our 9slice class, and we use the same asset each time, what's going to end up happening is we're going to try to update our texture repeatedly with our top left and our top middle and all of our frames for our 9slice image. And if we already have those, we don't actually need to go ahead and do all of our logic to add these to our texture. Instead, we can go ahead and return early because we already have that data. And so to do that, we're just going to add a simple check and we're going to say if our texture, and we're going to use the getFrameNames method. And what this will do is it's going to return an array of strings that have all of the names of our frames that currently exist. And so what you can do is you can provide an optional argument here for including the base. And so that's going to include the base frame in that output. And so if we do false, what will happen is this output should be an empty array for the first time we run this code. And so we can use that and we'll check our length, and so we'll say if our length does not equal 0, then we want to go ahead and just return early. And so to keep track of that, we're just going to go ahead and do our console log statement, but this won't be a warning. We'll just do this as a debug. Since this is an issue, this will happen if we create 2 instances. And so we'll say the provided texture asset key already has additional frames. All right, and so for the time being, this logic will work, but later on, we might want to go ahead and make this more refined where we validate that that array actually has all of the keys that we need. But for the time being, we're just going to assume that it will have them if the length is greater than 0. All right, so if we go ahead and save, there should be no changes to our scene. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create another instance of our 9slice class just to validate our changes. So what we'll do is we're going to come to our init method where we create our 9slice menu. And I'm just going to copy this block of code here. And we're just going to make a temporary variable called x equals that new 9slice instance. And so what we should see, there shouldn't look like anything different should happen on our scene. But if we come into our console and we change our levels to verbose, what we should see is we should see our long message where we already have our texture asset keys provided. And so we're going to skip adding those to our texture. And so by doing that, we're just adding that extra safety check so then that way we don't overwrite anything. All right, so what we'll do is let's go ahead and get rid of that extra instance since we don't need it. All right, so one last thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and jump back to our 9slice class, and we're going to go ahead and add in our jsdoc types for our 2 methods. So for create 9 slice textures, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll add in our types. So we'll have our phaser, textures, texture manager, and then for our asset key, this will just be a string. And for this method, we will return nothing. So we'll go ahead and put it in void. Then what we'll do is we'll come down to our public method and we'll go ahead and add our types. So we'll have a phaser, scene, and then we'll have a number for our target width and our target height. Now this method, we will return something, and this will be our phaser 3 game objects container. All right, and with that, that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to start building out our options scene, and we're going to work on connecting that to our title scene. And so in our options scene, this is where we'll have some of our settings for setting things like skipping our battle animations, the speed of the text, changing the color of our menus, and different things like that. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.